everybody, and welcome back to the Problem with Authority podcast. Today, I have a special guest, Miss Kathryn Casello. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Kiersten.
Yes, I'm so excited to have this conversation. Today, we will be discussing the problem with privilege and politics. And Kathryn is a former FSU alum, which was super exciting. I had known her a little bit around the college because when did you graduate?
So I finished my BSW at FSU in 2019, and then I went straight into the master's program. And so it was the accelerated, or not accelerated, but the advanced placement program. So it was just 3 semesters, and I did the social leadership track. And so I graduated in July of 2020.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, so it wasn't too far before me.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely. And it was just so wild because I felt like I finished my bachelor's and I was like, okay, here we go. Like, time for my master's. Like, here's where I'll really start to feel like a professional and really feel like I know exactly what I'm doing. And then I had 3 semesters of my master's and I was done. And I was like, oh God, like I still don't know what I'm talking about.
I just had a conversation about that with my coworker because I graduate in July with my master's in clinical.
Wow.
And I was telling her, I was like, I don't know anything about to graduate and be a clinician. So I'm definitely feeling all of that right now.
That seems to be the way that, like, the more that you learn about something, the more that you realize how much you don't know and how much more there is to find out about it.
Yes, but that's the beauty of learning and continuing to learn and falling in love with it.
Absolutely. And then when I did my bachelor's placement, I was at the state attorney's office in Leon County with their victim advocacy program. And that's when I really felt, that was like the first time that I had really felt drawn to some of the more like pseudo-clinical side of social work. I was like, wow, I really love working with these individuals, and like case management was really interesting, working in victim advocacy. So then when I was doing my master, I was working at FSU's victim advocate program, and I worked there until I left for 2020 summer. And this is like my entire resume. I feel like I'm telling you.
Well, just when you go to get a new job, just say, listen to the podcast.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. Yeah. They'll be like, can you submit your cover letter? I'm like, here's an hour-long podcast episode. But yeah, so I did that for a while, and that was amazing. Just a really incredible way to connect with the Tallahassee community and FSU's student population. And then I did my master's internship placement with Disability Rights Florida. So I kind of have like this palette of different policy experience and political experience, and a mix of like nonpartisan work and then much more partisan work. And now I'm in the DC area, and I work as the program coordinator for the Women's National Democratic Club. And it's essentially like a membership organization and a club for Democratic women all over the country, but concentrated in DC. And they have tons of different programming, and I kind of help with the coordinating programs that happen to bring in speakers and have that kind of stuff happening at the club. So it's been a really crazy couple years, but it's been really exciting.
It really has. You've jumped from one thing to the next.
Yeah.
And that's how it really seems in social work, especially when you do advanced standing, because it's only a year and then you're out into the real world. But I think that's so cool. I love hearing about social workers' paths to where they get to after, post-grad, what the profession really looks like. And I remember I took one of your suicide prevention trainings.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Oh my goodness.
I did, yes, when I first got into the program. And then I remember the march.
Wow.
After the Parkland shooting. So I didn't know you were behind that. So that's really awesome.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. That's so sweet of you. And yeah, that was so crazy because the interesting thing about that was that it really happened like so organically. Like a student had created a Facebook page for a march on a day of the week, and it was like quickly had like hundreds of people on it, and we reached out to them, and me and my friend, who are both doing gun violence prevention, reached out to the organizer, and we were like, hey, we'd love to help you. We don't know if you have any organizing experience. And the student was like, nope, I'm actually a film major. I've never done anything involving advocacy or activism. And I just really felt like this was important. Like, it would be great to have your help. And like, so many different organizations and individuals put in their time and money to make that happen. And it was like,
Wow.
I mean, that was a really incredible experience. I'm so glad you were there. It was very cool.
Yes, yes. And collaboration is so beautiful, especially when you see it at that college level. That's what us and FAMU just started a collaboration to do a kickoff for Social Workers Are Essential, Social Work Month, and experiencing the energy and just dedication of other social workers or just other people in general to support each other and in a cause that you all believe in is a really powerful and I think addictive feeling.
Totally. Oh, absolutely. I completely agree. I think once you kind of get a taste for what can be accomplished when you bring a lot of people to the table and start organizing, it's like, wow, like we were able to bring like 1,000 people to FSU's campus for the march in like a week. Imagine what we could do in a month. And I think that was it was a very cool experience. And I think kind of tying back to what we had talked about discussing on today's like episode, one of the things that was really interesting about that was it, like, a lot of those like resources and the organizing and everything like kind of came out of the woodwork. And when you like looked out at the group of people who were marching, it was a lot of young white people, and you just can't help but think like, you know, would those same resources and opportunities be put out there and be provided if this was, if this was a school, if Marjory Stoneman Douglas had been a majority ethnic minority school, if there had been a majority of Black students there, would it have had the same response? And would would people have contacted me saying that they can get posters made and bring megaphones and bring speakers and, bring people to help if this had not been something that affected a lot of white people?
Yes, and that mindset is so important, especially where you are in that position in DC, because a lot of people who make decisions hold privilege, and not all the time, or is that ever a great thing, because they're making decisions about situations they don't know a lot about. And in our discussions before, you brought up a really interesting point. I'm kind of just going to read it word for word, and then you can take off with it. But you talked about how privilege in more progressive spaces can sometimes manifest in this very defensive place, and a tendency to disengage or be like, I just don't understand how this could happen, right? And just take that defensive approach as if it's a scapegoat to you not having to do any work and you not having to talk to people directly that are in those communities. Think about how your privilege might have looked differently in a different space. If somebody, for example, a woman of color was impacted, would she get the same resources that you would? And can you just elaborate more on that in your field up there in DC?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That just like fires off so many different little thoughts in my mind. Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing where it's like, it was a group of FSU students who organized, that march. If it had been FAMU students organizing, would it have had the same, would people have stepped forward immediately to offer their resources? I don't know.
Right.
And I do think that happens a lot of times with privilege and kind of the way that it interacts in terms of your interpersonal dynamics is it happens similarly in social work spaces as it does in kind of activist spaces. And I think I think part of that is because if you're in social work, for example, a lot of times it's because you may have experienced something or seen someone else's experience that pushed you towards the helping profession. A lot of people who work in, a lot of social workers who work in domestic violence and family violence have experienced some violent experiences in their own lives, or a lot of times people who are survivors gravitate towards the profession. And a very similar thing happens with activists. Cori Bush is in the House of Representatives, and she was a Black Lives Matter organizer on the ground, I think in Ferguson, or I think maybe Chicago. It's terrible that I can't remember exactly where she's from, but she started as a grassroots activist because she was a community member and was attracted to the cause. And now she is in Congress. And so a lot of times you kind of like, you've experienced something traumatic and then you're drawn to kind of help people and share your story. When your experience is being challenged, that like, hey, maybe you were born into a experience that you didn't have to deal with as much bad stuff as other people. Maybe other people might have it worse than you. When you've experienced trauma and you haven't really worked through it, that can feel like an attack sometimes. That like, no, I didn't have it easy. I had to go through a lot. Like, and I object to the idea that I somehow got off easy. And so I think that like, because everyone has had some sort of experience and everybody is really passionate, if you don't really take the time to look inward at yourself and find a way to validate yourself, you will kind of project that onto other people. And I think that that's something that happens, is people are like, well, I don't want anybody to tell me that I had it easy. And so I'm just going to kind of disengage from this experience.
I 100% agree. I did a whole post on my Instagram about self-awareness in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer, talking about people's privilege and the importance of doing that inner work, because and recognizing and working through. And I like how you relate that to trauma in a lot of ways, because I've heard people have conversations where they are discussing Black Lives Matter and then a white person is like, oh, well, I grew up poor, type tit for tat type thing. And it's like, well, that's not what we're saying. We're not attacking you because of you personally. We are saying that you hold a certain amount of privilege and you need to recognize that. We're not saying that to invalidate your experiences. We are saying that because right now in this moment, Black men and women are dying and they are being killed by police. Police brutality is an issue. Racial profiling is a huge issue right now. And we need to take our privilege and assist in stopping this, is essentially, right? And I think during that time, it was so interesting to be on the internet and just, I mean, not really interesting, honestly, terrifying, because just some of the things that people would say, I was just appalled and confused, because the internet, we were very, very polarized at the time, and people would kind of just they would find their niches, they would find their people that would, hype them up, validate them, and a lot of lies and misinformation would spread. And then we just had all these different groups of people being against something that's a human issue. And it turns political. And right now I'm taking a feminism class, and, their slogan for the longest time is "the person is political." And at the time that was needed because women were not seen as humans, But now it's almost like, do we have to go back to saying this is a human issue, not a politics issue? It doesn't matter if you are Republican or Democrat. You are a human, and this is going to affect you.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that something that happens is that people experience something traumatic. Like, for example, somebody experiences sexual assault, and then maybe they gravitate towards the movement because, they want to get involved and they want to help other people. But, you also have to look inside and figure out, like, is there something else that I need here that maybe the movement is not going to satisfy? If you gravitate towards social change and if you feel drawn to the movement, I just think it's really important to look inside about what exactly your goal is. Because I think that there's a lot of different, for example, in second wave feminism, a big part of what was happening was this sort of consciousness raising, where women were getting together into spaces and getting a chance to really talk about what was happening in their lives and in their minds and in their relationships and with their families. And so there was a whole therapeutic aspect to what was happening beyond just the advocacy. And we see the same things in the disability community, where when people who have been historically marginalized get a chance to come together and share their experiences, like, it can be very therapeutic because they've been suppressed for so long. And I think women, especially, women particularly, there was a lot of pressure on them to just, like, be happy, get married, have your kids, and, like, getting a chance to actually unpack the psychological impact of that was really, really therapeutic. But that is not that's not the activism side. Like that is a personal part of it that is very important. But like you can't, you have to make sure that you're not looking for validation from the movement, and that you find a way to get that validation from yourself, from your loved ones, potentially from a counselor, because if you're getting all of your validation from a political movement, it's very easy to feel alienated by that when the conversation shifts to something else, or someone else's experience comes into conflict with your own. And this was something that I started to feel myself doing when I was doing gun violence prevention. Is for a long, there's a lot of different branches of gun violence prevention and different theories. And for a while I was like, yeah, let's just like, blanket bans. And I was definitely more in favor of more stringent gun control. And then as I've learned more about the ways that, US law has been used to deprive Black Americans of their Second Amendment right, I was like, maybe we need to look at this like in a race critical framework. And maybe we need to look at like, is this really the best move? Or should we be trying to find more like, city specific policies that work, or more locally, or, who do we need to be listening to beyond just my personal story with gun violence? And so I think that is definitely part of it, is that people maybe are like, I can't wait to be involved in this movement and, finally feel like I have a place here. And that is super important. And I think that that's what we're all looking for. But at the same time, like if you start to feel defensive, is it because this person is wrong, or is it because you haven't sorted something out yourself?
Yes. Wow. You said that so beautifully. And talking about the danger, like the dangers of advocating from that such personal place. And it's like the therapeutic aspect of it, like you kept saying, is very important, but a lot of the times it's just a byproduct of it. It's a byproduct of having those conversations and meeting and rallying with people who are your people, essentially, and they believe in you. And then if somebody comes up from a different area and you now see that they are experiencing oppression, injustice, you're like, whoa, but what about me? Like, I still haven't gotten my full validation yet.
Yes.
And if you put that validation in people accepting or boosting the movement, then like what you're saying, that can really put somebody on the defense.
Yeah. And I think we see that happening in, a lot of different parts of the movement. I think we definitely see that happening in the LGBTQ community. And, and I follow a lot of different, when I was interning at Disability Rights Florida, I started to follow a lot of people who are part of the disability community on Twitter. And something that I see all the time is that, individual activists are like, I use a different word for my body and my experience as a disabled person than somebody else might. And the fact that we use different terms, like things come into conflict. One of the most interesting tweets I ever saw, her Twitter is Crutches and Spice. Her name is Amani. And she's a disability rights advocate, but she tweeted about when the accessibility needs are in conflict. So she has I don't know how to describe it exactly, but she has the like crutches that you hold on to them, like instead of the ones that go under your armpits, you kind of hold them. And she was saying that the ramps, like having ramps in front of buildings, is really important for people who have a wheelchair. But when she uses those specific crutches, it's much easier to go up steps, and the ramps like make it really hard. And so like if there's only a ramp, it's actually harder for her to get up. And so like being able to recognize that like those things coming into conflict just means that we need to do more work to make it accessible for everybody. And we need to do more work to make sure that everybody's able to get in the building. It's not like there should be no ramps, get rid of all ramps. Like that should definitely not be the dialogue.
Right. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I literally talk about this so much because a lot of it's hard separating activism from the media to real life. And to the different conversations that you're going to have with people in real life versus people on the internet. And a lot of what I see on social media is people just being so polarized that we can't even get to that point of the conversation of, hey, there's conflicts within movements. Mm-hmm. There's disagreements between people that have similar experiences. And we're humans.
Of course.
Like, we're all unique. And it's so like, but you can't even get to that point because a lot of people on the internet are like, well, I just don't believe that like X, Y, and Z should have rights. And it's like, what?
Yeah. How is this even like, this is not productive at all. And it's really difficult, I think, and I think I've definitely kind of gotten into like an echo chamber at this point. Like I don't really know a ton of people who are really far right anymore. I just, since 2016, I've been whittling them away on my, on my Facebook, but like you kind of start to get, it's just difficult in really in more progressive spaces because people are, you know, they're kind of losing their ability to distinguish between, you know, like the personal is political, but just because it feels personal doesn't always mean that it like is a political attack.
Right.
And so I think like, and that's something that we talk about with social work all the time is cultivating your cultural humility skills, and then also trying to, you know, stop like cross projection, basically. What is the, you know, what I'm talking about?
Countertransference.
Yes, countertransference. And I think the same thing, you know, in the same way that we want to be looking at our clients in a way that is multifaceted and bringing in all of the systems, like we need to also turn that eye in on ourselves and understand, you know, trying to say like, am I upset at this person because it's triggering me and thing bad that happened to me, or am I upset because I have like a viable political alternative? Like, and that is it's a very difficult line to walk, but in the same way that social workers need to get therapy, I mean, every single activist who I've ever met, myself included, also needs to get some therapy and sort some things out.
Yes, because we come from a very emotional place,
right.
And another thing in social work that's talked about a lot is, you know, they tell us all the time to get therapy, but they also say that like you don't want to project your issues onto your clients. And a big thing about that, I think it crosses over with labels, I think, in a lot of ways. Because if I'm a woman, right? I identify as a woman. And when you dive into feminism, it's empowering, but at the same time exhausting. And if I haven't, you know, gone to therapy and done the inner work to be okay with what has happened to women, what happens to me now on a day-to-day basis because I'm a woman, and all of those different things, the label and the work can be exhausting. And I think, and people love labels and people hate labels for many different reasons, but when I struggle with like identifying so strongly as a woman that to a lot of people, woman equals oppression, but I don't see myself as less than.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like it's so hard. And that goes with any type of label. And
Absolutely.
A lot of the times I'm just like, can I just be a human?
Yes.
Can I exist?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think like that, yes. Oh my gosh. I have been thinking about this so much that like for women, and I think that this will kind of start to be, this is something that is, I think, a common thread across a lot of marginalized communities. For a woman, sometimes the pinnacle experience of being a woman is about suffering. It's about pain, which sucks. Like when transphobic people, for example, you know, kind of in bad faith argue about trans people saying like, well, what does it even mean to be a woman? What is that? You know, how do you know you're a woman? What does it mean to be a woman? And the traditional wisdom is like, oh, the pain of childbirth, menstruation, the experience, you know, the male gaze, the experience of being a young woman in a room full of older men who doubt your ability. And like, that sucks. Like that is like not how I want my life to be defined by the
No.
experience of pain. And I think a similar experience happens with other marginalized communities who they, you know, sometimes it feels like the defining feature of your identity is that you've experienced oppression, you've experienced violence and discrimination. And, you know, that starts to blur a lot of the lines when it comes to activism, because it's like, yeah, this isn't just a policy. This is something that happened to me personally. And I think, you know, it's important to recognize the things that are happening to people, and it's extremely important to keep our eyes open to violence, but for your own well-being, you know, it would be good for people to figure out, what does it mean for yourself on your own terms?
Yes.
So, because it's not like, that's sad. That's very sad. And it definitely makes it much harder to find common ground when you're always coming from a place of like, well, I need to protect, like I need to defend, and I need to, like, you know, never let this happen to me again. It's like, okay, what do you want to do now? What's the good things that you want to feel and how you want to live your life? Because that, like, the goal, gosh, one of my favorite content creators is ContraPoints. She's a trans woman. And she says the end goal of a movement, of a political movement, isn't to be valid. It's political liberation and change, and like actual quality of life increasing. It's not like, yay, like no more homophobes, you're valid now. So we have to find a way to, you know, and it's honestly very comforting to orient yourself around a real tangible goal. And I think that's why so many people, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I really gravitated towards people like Bernie Sanders, who he definitely it focuses a lot on political or on concrete economic goals. And you're like, okay, cool. $15 minimum wage. That's an easy fight. You know, I can throw my energy into that and not, and be able to fight and have policy positions and stuff like that.
Yes. And you're so right too about, just the multiple hats and the intersectionality of everything. Going back to like people saying, like transphobic people saying, you know, questioning people who are trans, you're not a woman because this is what being a woman is, and then that's tied to suffering. And a lot of the times women like who are transphobic can't see how that is negative on them as well. And so really just if we can get past that, like what you're talking about, that personal tie to it, a woman could be like, wait a minute.
Yes.
Wait a second. That then me being this way is just counterintuitive, and then nobody is getting anywhere.
Yes.
None of us are going to further ourselves if we are not all here in this fight together.
Yes, absolutely.
And, that's such a good point.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Yeah, thank you so much. I completely agree. And it's like, it's interesting because it's like a lot of cisgender women are kind of gatekeeping womanhood. And it's, you know, and I understand the inclination to do that, because it's like, well, you never had to, you know, if you transitioned when you were in your 20s, you never had to walk past a construction zone and have people whistle at you. You never experienced like harassment in schools on the basis of being a woman. Like, you never had to go through that. That's something I had to go through, and it was painful, and I don't want someone to take that away from me. And, you know, the first thing is like, you know, just that doesn't take that away from you. It's okay. Like you went through a lot, and that was really tough, but that doesn't change, you know, someone being trans doesn't change that. But the other thing too, I think that's important is like, just because it wasn't the same struggle of growing up a young girl, like not understanding your body, like doesn't mean that, you know, those trans people continue to face some other kind of oppression or discrimination. You know, like if you can open yourself up to what it would be like to be, you know, a young person assigned male at birth and feel completely alien in your body. And, you know, as you're starting to go through puberty, you don't really understand what's going on and it's painful, or just not feeling like you're living your life authentically. Like that is really, really hard. And I think like if you can kind of come to terms with your own experience and recognizing that like, yes, that happened, but that doesn't have to be the defining part of being a girl. Like you can
Exactly.
process and work through your trauma, and then we can find other ways to celebrate being a woman beyond shared pain.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that gave me chills.
You are so sweet. It's very easy to talk to you. You're very good at interviewing.
Yes, you as well. Thank you so much. These are the conversations that I just dreamed of having on this podcast, and really getting down to just the complexity of everything.
Totally.
Of it all.
It's one of my favorite parts about this profession, honestly, is that that's what we all want to talk about and are thinking about.
Yes, it truly is honestly amazing. A beautiful community, I will say that. So now that we have discussed a lot of the places that privilege can intervene, or your own personal trauma can intervene with a movement, where do we go from that? How do we move forward or provide solutions for how to better take up spaces in these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I've already talked a lot about kind of trauma-informed activism almost. But I also think that part of that is like learning about yourself, but I also think that it comes down to kind of a commitment to continuing to learn about things. And I think part of that is being willing to kind of maybe step out of your comfort zone and seek out like Black and LGBTQ content creators on YouTube who are making videos, and like, take some time to try to read how to be an anti-racist, and read some books or listen to podcasts or listen to books on tape. And like, I think that this is something that we talk a lot about in social work, is like continuing to get education that helps you learn more about the field and be, always being as competent as possible. But I think it's also about, like, if you ever start to feel yourself being like, I think I've heard enough. I think I've learned enough. I think I know enough about this. Like, question why you feel that way. Because in my experience, like, the more that you dive into something, the more you realize that you really don't know much about the topic. There's a lot more that needs to be learned.
Yep. Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. That continuing education. And I think also with that comes forgiveness. Like earlier you talked about how before you were very much, blanket, anti-guns, but then you learned more about it and you were like, wait a second, if I do that, then this could negatively affect somebody else, but I feel this way because of my own personal experience. And I think nowadays we don't have that forgiveness. People are labeled a certain way for, certain decisions, and we don't allow ourselves to learn and grow. And I think that deters people from the process of education, speaking about different issues from their perspective, and then feeling comfortable in failure, or like being wrong or hurting somebody from your position or opinion. And I saw this, I was reading Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis, and in that book it talked about how when feminism first started, it was beautiful movement helping so many women, and in order for us to get our rights and the right to vote, but women in prison at the time were negatively affected by the movement in ways of I can't remember the specific ways, that's terrible right now, but I will be doing a podcast episode on it. But just know that like that's how a lot of things work sometimes. And did the women outside free and not in prison intend for that to be for the women that were incriminated? No, I really don't think so, but it can be a product. And I remember Shalay Jackson, or Dr.
I love Shalay.
Jackson, love her at College of Social Work. I remember one of the first things she taught me when taking those policy classes was you can't advocate wrong. And I was like, yeah, you're right.
Absolutely.
You can.
Yeah, well, we talk about this a lot in like policy spaces. So about like legislation and stuff is a disparate impact. And and this was something that we talked a lot about in Disability Rights Florida, is that the policy, like actual policy that's being written that's intended to lift people up and help to enfranchise people and help people bring them in who are living on the margins. Like, if you don't really do the work to question things, and question, the outcomes, and look at where all the different things fall into place, sometimes these policies will have an unintended negative consequence. And if we don't, cultivate a culture where it's normal to question things and to have dialogue and to not always have the right answer, but two, allow ourselves the grace to grow, and then hopefully that grace can be extended to other people. You won't be able, if what's expected, if the expectation is perfection right away, 100% of the time, you're saying the right thing, the right answer, and the right solutions being implemented, I mean, that's really not how it truly all hashes out. And we all need to be able to say hey, I love this bill. I wrote this bill myself. I've spent, weeks pouring through it and trying to make it look good and doing everything that I can for my community. If somebody, knocks on your door and says, hi, we're from the associate, we're from the teachers union, and this is bad for teachers. I know you think you're helping students, but this is actually really going to, degrade our ability to bargain or degrade our ability to have any prep time for these students. You need to take a second, and rather than being this bill is my baby, I've worked so hard on this. I don't want to hear it. That's bad advocacy.
Yep. Oh my goodness. I definitely agree. And it goes back to humanizing ourselves. And I think humbling ourselves in a sense of America loves, capitalism and we're productive all day long. We never sleep. And then when we talk about all the time, I'm self-made. I did this by myself. And it's no. I think very rarely do a lot of us have an original thought. It's because we are all influenced by each other. And I never want to claim that I'm an expert. I never want to claim that I fully did something by myself. And that bill example is such a perfect one, because I think a lot of people would just put their feet in the ground and be no, I did all this work. I want to get credit. I did it by myself. I can't even think about including you just because you voiced your concern, but I just can't include you in it. And and then there's also a lot of pressure, on getting things out, because the media and people wanting change instantly and now. And I know too, a lot of the time with marginalized groups, it's exhausting when every 5 minutes somebody is debating if you should have rights or not, if you should, have resources to live your life on this earth, especially with a long history that, the entire world has had, doing that to each other. So I definitely, can sympathize and understand the urgency and the anger.
Yes,
and
absolutely. And that's why I think that it's especially important for people, like me, who I was born into a middle-class family. I'm a white woman. I'm cisgender. Because I don't have to constantly be trying to prove to people and debate people that I deserve rights and that I, deserve not to be discriminated against. I, should be able to pick up a book every once in a while or watch an episode of something to learn a little bit more about what's happening in this community and what's happening here. It's very, very easy. And it's, it doesn't, if somebody else is really, you shouldn't be hassling random Black people on the internet to explain racism to you. It's really on the people who have been born into privilege to be taking that extra step and being extra patient, and listening and trying to learn. And I think that sometimes it's also important to remember that this is not the, we're not the first generation to start advocating for change. And when you kind of start to look back at the history of the movement, you can see, how it's come and how people are always theorizing and debating and coming up with better terms and better solutions, and, trying to keep in mind the history of activism and, where people may be coming from in one direction. And I think remembering all of that and keeping that into perspective can be helpful in remembering that like this isn't the very beginning and we're not reinventing the wheel. But at the same time, for people who maybe feel like they're sort of in the beginning stages of advocacy, it can feel really intimidating that there's like 60 years of literature to be, there's all this stuff that's out there. And that's why I definitely think like people should kind of start small and look for a couple different sources that they really trust or that really appeals to them. I think there's a lot of nonsense on YouTube, but there also is a lot of really awesome, thought-provoking content. ContraPoints, Cat Black is really fantastic. And they recommend a lot of different creators who are talking about all sorts of different issues. And just, even if it's like once a week for 30 minutes, like watch this video or listen to some of an audiobook about, different political struggles that are happening, and even reading like nonfiction. There's this fabulous book that my friend recommended to me. And I have to just look up the author. It's called Passing by, oh my goodness. The book is called Passing, and it's about being white passing. And it's set like in the 20s. But it's a short story, like very like Great Gatsby-esque. It's by Nella Larson. And that is like a fabulous like short story, kind of giving some insight into what it would be like to be a light-skinned Black woman in America in the 1920s, and navigating the interpersonal stuff, and engaging with content and with material that isn't just about, that isn't exclusively about slavery. And because there's been a lot that has happened since then, and a lot of systemic stuff that has happened that trickles into our culture. And I think like, even if it's going to take a decade for us to have meaningful legislation in criminal justice reform, the social and cultural work that needs to be done by every single person every single day.
Yes.
And
yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. Literally beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Yes.
The work is not linear.
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
Tell you that right now. But we all have a responsibility for each other to help. And it's really as simple as that. And thank you for sharing those resources. I'm sure that will be really helpful to a lot of people.
Thank you so much, Kiersten. Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay, so now let's get into the double standard with community organizing in politics.
My goodness.
Take us on that ride.
Yeah, I'm like, for 9 minutes, I will... No, I know. And I think it's one of those, it all ties together, because I think, for me, and I'm sure for many people around the country, watching the riots at the Capitol on January 6th was a very strange experience. And, people felt a lot of horror and fear. And I think for me, like, I don't think I felt super surprised. I was I wasn't surprised that it was happening. I think ever since the Charlottesville demonstrations a few years ago, I kind of was like, all right, so it's only a matter of time before white supremacists, bubble over. I think I wasn't surprised that it was occurring. What I was very surprised about was like watching it unfold like it was reality TV. There was no police. There was there was really nothing going on for a long time. And I think that when, and a lot of people that I was interacting with in political spaces were like, how did this happen? I can't believe how unprepared, the city was, how unprepared Capitol Police were. And it's kind of a similar thing that I was hearing, like when we went during the election in November, where people were like, well, I can't believe that, 15 million people voted for Trump, I can't believe, and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, how can't you believe it? Like, they did it 4 years ago. They're doing it again. Like, it's, I know that it's painful to watch and it can be upsetting, but like, you have to have some inkling of how this happened. And especially when you look at the way that Black Lives Matter protesters and organizers have been treated by the authority in DC over the summer, just a lot of kettling and arrests and and they're just walking around in the street, saying somebody was murdered, an innocent person was murdered, stop killing innocent people. It's very jarring to see that the difference in response. And I think that especially when you kind of get into like an echo chamber, or you kind of get siloed when you're living, because DC is a very progressive place. And so I think a lot of people who live here and who work here were like, how could this happen? Like, I see Biden signs everywhere, and I see Black Lives Matter signs all over the place. And, it happened because people have internal, deep set biases that they aren't really dealing with. And then when, people learn that there's this rally that's being organized with a bunch of Trump supporters, and they're all going to come and they're going to, they're saying they're going to take their country back. You don't, because you haven't done the work internally to get rid of your biases, you're like, well, how dangerous could it be? And I think that's something that we need to reckon with, is like, just because you feel like everything is fine and you're good and you and your friends aren't problematic, like, that is not always the reality. And like, no matter where you live, doesn't matter if you're in the North or the South, like, there is going to be prejudice and bigotry, and it's hard, but we have to open our eyes to it. And I think that a lot of times, like, white people who end up coming forward and wanting to spearhead a movement, people are like, that's so amazing, you're the future. And then Black organizers are kind of characterized as sort of troublemaking, and, what's the point of doing this anyway? It's why are you even out here doing this anyway? How is this going to solve anything? And it's this, and this might be a little bit, I don't know if people might want to hear this, but something that I've heard in terms of this whole thing where it's like, oh, well, the South is so bad and so racist. I saw something, I can't remember exactly who said it, but it's like, in the South, Black people can get close, but the people don't like them going up too high. But if in the North, you're fine to get up as high as you want, but don't get too close. And it's sort of this like idiom to explain that, like, in some places the racism is out and out. They are hanging nooses, and there's, harassing people who are holding a Black Lives Matter sign. But then in other places, it's more about locking your car doors and crossing the street. And I think we have to, nobody is immune to society. We live in a society. And when we think that we have done everything that we need to do and everything is fine, then we find ourselves in this position where we're like, I cannot believe that this many people supported this person. It's like, well, there's entire states that went red. Again, they always do. They will every year. There's not, it's going to be a long time before we see some of these states turn even purple. And if you're in a position where you're like, I can't even wrap my head around it, well, you should try. You probably should try. Like,
yeah, exactly. And I've heard the same thing. My sister watches YouTuber, and she's a Black woman. I can't remember what. I think she might be in PR, because my sister does PR, so I think that's what she might do. But she said that she moved. I think she was from the South, left the South, went to the North. But she said the racism in the North was scarier because it was so, like, hidden, but, like, manipulative and just more terrifying than in the South. Because in the South, they're just openly racist, but there are certain parts where I'm accepted. But she said that in the North, like, no, you're not really accepted anywhere. And I thought that was so interesting to learn, because I had never heard anybody describe
it's like that. In certain places, it's like, it's much more direct that, this is, this is how they want their community to look. They want their community to be white. But then in other places, you experience such intense structural oppression, and people are like, no, we have look at our diversity policy on our website. And that is really, it's a very interesting, oh gosh, there's just a very interesting dynamic, because it's stuff like that where it's like, well, we put out a statement saying XYZ like this, so there you go. But we still need to continue to do that work. And I think something that ContraPoints says, Natalie Wynn is her name, but she has just absolutely incredible content. As she says, is like, she gets criticized sometimes for she gets characterized as like sympathizing with, white supremacists, or trying to understand where they're coming from. And what she said is, she's like, what she believes is that understanding bigotry is the best defense against becoming a bigot yourself. And so it's like, we may not be able to bring someone over to our side. We might not always be able to convince somebody that they need to not get a swastika tattooed on themselves. Like, we may not always be able to convince someone to change their minds. But what we can do is check ourselves and make sure that, like, we are not slipping, is there some part of this that maybe I need to address? Is like, there's something that I believe that maybe is coming from, it may be well-intentioned, but it's actually rooted in this systemic problem. And I think that's really, because we do need to be fighting bigotry, but we also need to be able to recognize it inside of ourselves.
Yes. And with all that, like, it's that performative activism. And that's a scary part where I think I see a lot of places going, is like, I did, the bare minimum. I put the rainbow flag on my website. I have, you're saying like in DC, like, you saw a lot of, Joe Biden signs, and it's like, well, if you live in a culture where, people are really going to attack you if you are against those things, then it is very easy to mask and pretend that you are.
Right.
And low key, you're not. And that is where it can get really scary. But then at the same time, like you're saying, you can still be pointing your fingers at other people when, like, your side isn't even fully, educated, ready to really go and do the work because of all those internal things that you just haven't dealt with yourself. And I think that's a really good point.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think it's just one of those things where, like, if you are already feeling like you're being attacked, and then maybe you have had some sort of traumatic experience in your life where you were attacked and you did experience something bad, and then someone is, you're on the defensive about your beliefs, you can be feeling like re-traumatized. You may feel kind of triggered by the conversation, which is obviously bad for you emotionally, but it's definitely not great for your ability to participate in the movement. But it also kind of, you're quick to be like, well, me, what about you? And, it's important that we all, you can't have justice without accountability, but it goes both ways. Like, the person who is, the body that holds somebody accountable also needs to be accountable for their own actions. And I think that it's hard. Like, it's really hard to feel like you have space to grow, especially with the internet and with, like, your every, with your every thought. There's some things that I tweeted a couple years ago, and I look at them and I'm like, God, that was actually really, like, not good at all. Like, I don't know why I thought that, but, like, fortunately I'm not a public figure. And so I just deleted the tweets, like, made peace with what happened, like, looked inside myself, and I was like, maybe I need to, like, address some internalized, fat phobia or whatever it is. Like, that's something I need to do. And I've been able to grow from that. And I wasn't, like, burned at the stake. And I think that it's really, and it's really, that
cancel culture.
It's cancel culture is really something. And I talk about this with my boyfriend all the time. And it's like, cancel culture, canceling originated with Black women activists trying to, cancel R. Kelly, using a very equalizing medium like the internet to hold powerful people who are not responding to being sued. They're not responding to, accusations or whatever. Like, they're completely untouchable. Like, you can use social media and other equalizing mediums to hold those powerful people accountable. And I think that that is like super, super important. And instead, what I have kind of seen it, you know, and it still serves that purpose, I think, absolutely. But I also think that like a regular person is going to have some problematic stuff to say. And so like, I don't know what the utility really is of turning that spotlight onto each other internally within the movement, because it's like, we're all here because we don't want people to be oppressed. We're all here because we want to end violence against women. So I don't understand why doxing another activist, like how is that serving the movement's purpose in any way?
Yeah. And it really, especially when it's done over the internet, and I'm totally guilty of this.
Yeah, as in me. Yeah. Like I hear you.
and because it doesn't, it seems more for personal gain and more for, you know, the strike of it to be like, oh, look, I put down this person. So now the eyes are not going to be on me and the ways that I know that I'm going to mess up later on. Right. And I think a lot of the time we all don't take into consideration the messed up history that has gotten us to this point, and also the society values that are still really messed up that we are taught from birth to now. So like we have internalized misogyny, internalized homophobia, internalized racism. Like it, even if you are a part of those marginalized groups, you can still believe that white supremacist message. And we're not taught how to, you know, get in touch with ourselves, be self-aware, know our emotions. We're not taught how to talk to each other. We're not taught the basic things. So of course it seems like it almost should be expected that people are going to, you know, it should be expected that people are going to mess up because we're not perfect, but should expect that like growing up, like you said or believed like racist or homophobic things because you have institutions like the church pushing those values on you, but then you're confused because at home you see something different and then you feel something different inside, especially when you're a child. And I feel like, you know, it's navigating at what point, you know, do we hold each other accountable, to what lengths and at what age. But a lot of the things that I see on the internet, like
I know, like, this is a 14-year-old child, like with the anime emoji for their avatar. Like this is literally a child. And then it's also a child sometimes is like, you're canceled. And I'm like, you are a minor though. Like, I think that we need to we need to give everybody a lot of grace to grow, and to have a second chance. And I think you know, that is something about the internet that's nice, is it's like, if this person continues this behavior and they refuse to change, we will know soon enough. Like, we will be able to see that very clearly in their content. And like, that's when that's when you can kind of make more like fatalistic determinations about it. But I definitely think that a lot of people, you know, and just like you said, like a lot of this is socialized into you as you grow up. And like, especially if you're like, if you're a little kid and you're like really, really scared that you're going to go to hell, like that's going to affect you. And that is going to, you know, that's a kind of trauma in its own that is going to impact other things that you have to kind of unpack throughout your life. And it's just very, definitely. It's very, very interesting to see people kind of like publicly processing their trauma online, but like, and I really don't think, you know, I really don't think people are like, I have all these issues that I need to work through, but I'm just going to project. I'm just going to mask it with politics. Like, people don't really think that way, but you know, that's what is happening. And Twitter is a very interesting platform for that, because, you know, nobody goes on Twitter and is like, today, I'm not really sure. I wrote this tweet to let you all know that I'm kind of on the fence about something and I'm learning something. Like, you go on Twitter to be like, This is bad. Right? Don't ever do this. If you do this, you're a terrible person. Don't ask me any questions. Goodbye. And it's like, of course, of course, that's what the platform is. But, then it kind of creates this environment where everyone is like, okay, I need a hot take. Like, and there's no discussion to be had. And it's like, if you don't take a second to read through the comments, you might start to think that like, this is what everybody thinks and what everybody feels. And like, this is the final say. And I'm like, it's really just like a giant blog for everybody. Like there is definitely some good things happening in terms of like discussing theory, but that is the minority of the time. Like that, the actual parsing of the theory and deciding, what kind of society do we want to have, that's not really happening because people are channeling their own experiences into a policy position. And you kind of, when you are linking your own trauma to your policy position, when someone disagrees with the policy position, it feels like an attack on your own life, on your own lived experiences. I think people just really can set themselves up for a painful experience. Sometimes I follow this Black activist, and she was saying she's like, she was tweeting about how she's a revolutionary activist and she definitely believes in significant criminal justice reform. And she was like, but I can't bring myself to believe in and to support prison abolition when I was victimized by a member of my own family. I was sexually assaulted, and I would never be okay with that person just with going free in the world, And so like, that's a perfect example of your lived experience is going to impact your trauma. And if somebody is like, no, prisons are evil and you're evil for even thinking that a prison would be okay, even 1% of the time, like, geez, that is really painful to hear. And so it's so important just to really tap into yourself and be like, okay, if I put this opinion out into the world, am I going to survive it psychologically if somebody is on the other side of it? And if not, maybe I need to hold it in and just take some time to process it myself until I am ready. And then I can take it if somebody is like, prisons are evil, how dare you? And then you're like, okay, cool. That's where we're at on the spectrum.
Oh my goodness. And before I started this podcast or social media, I debated it for a long time because I know the culture of the internet. And I was like, and I hated a lot of the culture of the internet. And I was like, I, do have the capacity to make content that I don't see, that I feel might benefit, a situation, right? But also understanding that, like, for example, like I did that episode on like our prisons obsolete prison abolition, and talking about things in a way like that was my first dive into that, and making that a disclaimer, but then also being like, they got some good points, right? But then also these people got some good points, so it's like, how can we come together to like figure this out? And I think that's what I want to reflect, I think, or people going forward who are like, well, how do we engage on the internet? Like just dying to yourself and being like, look, you messed up. You're lucky because the things that you said when you were 16 are not on the internet, or people didn't care. But this person is now being like,
just torn to shreds,
just terribly publicly humiliated, and it's torn to shreds. And it's like, and know that like your opinions will probably change and your stances will probably change, and talk about things in a way that's like not like trying to pretend that like you are a god, like you
divine answer,
you hold like some type
I completely agree.
Yeah, like we don't. We're like humans. Like it's so funny. Like I love talking about aliens all the time because I'm always like, we are so boring. Like we can't do anything but like argue with each other and not be able to figure this stuff out. And I'm like,
right,
none of us are,
right,
like,
right.
that
I'm
cool.
like, this
like,
is very
like,
nerdy. It's very nerdy.
None of us can... Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. And it's just, it can be exhausting, but also taking us to a different direction, off the internet. I work with, I just, in this past year started working with preschoolers, 4-year-olds, middle schoolers, and high schoolers. and I run groups with them. And so I was thinking, you know, in my head, it's been a few years since I've been that age, you know, everybody seems to be a little more progressive. Like, you know, I'm sure the kids are coming in, you know, with all these great progressive, like, beautiful language and ideas, and they love each other. No, that is not the case.
Yeah,
Preschool,
no, it's awful. Being a high school student is a miserable, it's a horrible experience. You couldn't pay me enough to go back to high school.
Yes. No. And every day I'm sitting there and I look at my middle school and high school, and I just thank the gods above that I am not in their position anymore, because it's terrible. But a lot of the things that still runs rapid, like I see it with the 4-year-olds, is like them, you know, they fight so hard for like
that's
gender
so interesting.
being assigned to toys when they have like no stakes in the game,
right,
other than what their parents have told them. Like, we will fight so hard for things, I think, a lot of time that we don't even fully understand or may not even fully believe, you know?
Right.
Like, they are trying to hold the status quo as 4-year-olds, because I watch them, like, a kid will be like, oh, like, I want pink. And somebody looks at them and is like, pink is for girls. Like, if you like that, then
I know,
like,
you weren't born thinking that. Somebody explained that to you, and that is why you're parroting that.
Exactly. And then I can see it like, or when they're little, they're like, oh, you're a duty head, you're whatever, calling them names. But in my head, I see if that behavior is not corrected now, or there's not a conversation about it now, in middle school, it's going to be homophobia. In middle school, that's going to be racism. Or in elementary, you know, like, that's where it stems from. And then I have to have conversations with my middle schoolers. Like, they make homophobic comments. Every time a woman speaks up, all the males in the room attack her. And it's like, it just seems so simple, like, just little things. But if you start to have these conversations, I think, with people and kids when they're young, to start, you know, changing the societal influences that we've just, and that generational, like, curses, really, of the terrible messaging that we've been sending to each other, that's where, like, we can, I think, you know, begin to change on a human level, and not just when it comes to, like, policy and, you know, the systems and everything, because, you know, those things are always going to be there. But when it comes to interacting with one another, stopping, especially if you're in a position and you work with, like, kids, like, recognizing those things, pulling them aside and having a conversation, because kids will remember. I remember I came into the group, you know, later on, and so the kids didn't have, like, that much great rapport with me, but one of them, I was running the group that day by myself. And the student was just saying really terrible remarks about women and their bodies, and was very fat phobic and all of these things. And I talked to them and I said, hey, like, if you're just not attracted to somebody, you're not attracted to them. It doesn't have anything to do with what they look like, the size of their body, nothing. Like, you can just say, hey, like, I'm just not really attracted to them. You don't need to go and call them all these names, right? And so I didn't think that was going to have much of an impact, but the next week they looked at me and said, yeah, and I need to remember to respect, you know, women and their bodies. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, we had one quick conversation about it, and they remembered it. And I'm like, if we just start doing this, then you know, the horrors of high school and middle school and the bullying and, you know, all those terrible ideals that are just flipped around all over the place with, you know, those kids, then I think, like, we can make more progression on the, you know, society.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. And good on you for, like, taking the time to be like, you know what, actually, that's really not okay. Here's how this is supposed to be. Like, you can go ahead and do whatever you're doing, but it doesn't need to be mean and personal. And I think, like, that's definitely part of using your privilege to continue to educate people. And, you know, in your position, like, you're an authority figure. So you absolutely have the right to be like, hey, let's go ahead and try to develop a little bit better as a person. And I like, we can do that. Like, we are absolutely capable of doing that. And I think that that's something that happens, you know, with families, is it's like, look, I really don't want to get into a giant argument with my family, but I also, who else is gonna, like, if somebody doesn't say, hey, that was kind of messed up, you probably shouldn't say that. Like, if somebody doesn't at least say something, like, then it just goes on. And that was that. And, you know, I do think that even for adults, it's a little bit harder as an adult to kind of take some of that, you know, take that and learn and change. But it's, you know, if you just gently remind people a couple times, and if you care about the person and they care about you, you'll start to see like a change. You really will. And you know, I think it's important to try not to give up on people, and to, you know, look back at your own experiences and be like, you know, if everybody in my life had given up on me when I was in this bad place, or when I had this problematic, you know, belief, then I would never have gotten through it, and I wouldn't be able to like get to where I am now and be learning and growing, and trying to continue to have patience with people who it feels like, you know, they've watched a little bit too much Fox News and they're starting to go off the rails. Like, you know, it's you know, you got to try to at least have a couple normal, respectful interactions with them where you can try to get through to them. And I think, you know, I think for kids, it's part of human psychology that you want to belong. And a big part of belonging is conforming and reinforcing the standards that we've set in our society. It's like, okay, if you follow these rules, you will be good. You're not going to be on the outside, and you will have people who all, you know, relate to each other. And like, that's a very good feeling. And, you know, the thing that's cool about that is we get to set what those norms are. We can decide as a society and as a culture what we want that to look like. It doesn't have to be toxic masculinity. Like, it doesn't have to be hyper femininity all the time, or, you know, whatever. We get to decide that we live in a respectful society where we hear each other out, and then we make the decision that is best for as many people as possible, and we correct and we grow and change, and like, we get to make that our reality. And so I think with kids, it's just, it always, I think, and I think as a social worker, you start to feel this way, it like always comes back to education. And like making sure that they are hearing the truth, and that they are learning how to discern the truth from fiction. And like, you know, because kids are like sponges, you know, you're like, don't say that, you'll never hear from them again. Like, they are. It's pretty incredible that kids a lot of times will be like, they'll run with it. And there's so many stories of, you know, trans people or gay people being like, you know, teaching their younger family members, yep, this is my partner, or this is the name I want to use now. And they're like, oh, that's kind of weird, but okay. And then that's that. Like, they're pretty much good to go. And I think, like, you know, being willing to engage. And if people are lucky enough to have kids in their lives, like, you know, always continue to try to engage with them and talk to them and try to get them to talk about themselves. And I just find that like adults are like that too. Like they, you know, you've been taught your whole life to kind of repress and be productive and keep it together. But like, you know, people do want to connect with each other. And I think, like, you know, in the same way that we all want acceptance, and we want people to be patient with us, and we want people to learn about us before they judge us, like, we got to try to do the same thing for each other. And, you know, especially if you have a lot of privilege in society, you have an obligation to be more patient, be more understanding, be learning more, because you're not fighting for your life at every turn.
Exactly. No. And coming from that place, like, you can carry, you know, like a burden, if you will, of sitting there and having the possibility of somebody, you know, start yelling at you about like, hey, like, I think Black women should have rights, and then being like, no, but like, you can take that.
Yes.
You can take that better than a Black man, woman, or child, because to you, it's not as personal as
I totally
if they were talking to them, if that makes sense. So definitely just recognizing that and knowing that, like you were saying, like, we all really do want to connect with people, but also knowing, because this is something that I teach my kids a lot of the time, you know, we teach them about, you know, their stress and their trauma, but we never want to like push away their natural trauma responses. So like a lot of people, you know, in our bodies, we have an instinct, we have a gut feeling, right? And we never want to, you know, call a child, like if they see their mom and dad fighting, running into their room, like they see their mom and dad fighting and they run into their room.
Yeah, you have
like,
to stay there.
We don't want to start teaching them that, oh, that's a maladaptive behavior, that's not good, right? You know what I mean? Like, we never want to, you know, do that to anybody. So it's like your body has natural responses to, you know, what is a safe situation and what isn't. So that's why, to just give people a little bit more background, like with privilege, why that's so important, because you engaging in that conversation most likely is not going to put you in danger for your life, or, you know, give you, you know, PTSD and carry more trauma, you know, to have that conversation. And it goes back, I mean, really to just basic biology of our bodies and how we, you know, we react.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
we, you know,
I completely agree. One
things.
of my best friends recently had to go to a funeral it was a family member, and they went back to a pretty small, more isolated town. And at the funeral, they were all, you know, the family is like eating together and talking, and something about the election like came up, and the family started to say like some pretty dicey stuff, and it just was really hurting my friend to hear. But my friend is non-binary, and it was just like, am I really gonna start this conversation and be the only person on my side? Like I'm gonna be completely alone in this. I'm already pretty vulnerable because I'm at a funeral. And like, I don't have the energy to start this conversation, and that's okay. Like, I think people sometimes, you know, if you really want to be like, you know, and this is a classic social work thing, but it's like, you can't pour from an empty cup. Like, if you really want to be useful to the movement, you need to be building resiliency for yourself and taking care of yourself and being in a place where you can engage. And if you can't, it's really okay. Like, there will be many, many times in our lives where we can, you know, unlearn things and try to help and reach out to other people. And I think it's always super important to just be taking a step back, to center yourself and, you know, be like, is this something that I can handle? You know, if so, let's just try to engage and see where we're at. And I've had some very interesting conversations with people where, you know, it's always good, like, maybe don't be drunk, maybe don't be drinking if you want to have this like super intense conversation. Like, maybe don't bring it up at the very end of a dinner party, or like, you know, like Christmas Eve with your family. Like, maybe this is not the best venue for this conversation. But if you're kind of just hanging out and somebody says something and you're like, that was kind of a weird thing to say. I don't know if I agree with that actually. And then like see where they go with it and being like, you know, I heard this thing in class, or I saw this thing online. And I really think that we shouldn't be saying that. We should try to move towards this because it's more inclusive. And like, you start to kind of like, if you take it really slow and just have an open mind, people might surprise you, you know, if they might just be misguided. Like that might just be part of it.
And another pro tip for people listening, or social workers in general, a big thing that we're taught to do is how to bridge people together, I think. And I know a lot of the time, like this whole conversation is, you know, surrounding progressive views and, you know, we're all human and everything, right? But there are, you know, subcultures within, you know, the American culture and a lot of things that can influence that. And one of my questions I asked a few weeks back in my women's issues group, I was like, hey, how do I have conversations with, you know, 4-year-olds like that, you know, boys don't have gender, and, you know, getting away from that like gender binary type mindset.
Right.
When like the parents are not, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not there. How do I do this in a way that's not going to, you know, cause an issue? Or how do we engage with the parents? How do we bridge the gap and mediate and make this situation better so that their child can grow up in an environment that's accepting of everybody? And I think that's another, you know, big conversation that a lot of social workers, you know, take the step forward. They're like, all right, I'm here. I'm ready to start advocating. But then it's like, you're going to come into contact a lot of the time with people who don't agree with you. But how to explain it and navigate that conversation in a way where the other person can like maybe still not agree with you and see your side, but can understand that, you know, this type of education and inclusivity and just love essentially is necessary for us to thrive as humans. And so people with, you know, those social work skills, that's something that you can think about taking that next step to try and make sure that this stuff is integrated into your work. and the relationships that you have with people, the programs you're building, the kids that you're working with. And sometimes it's just like, I think good to say sorry after, you know, like I'm like with that kid, like I brought up body shaming and the next week he's like body shaming. I taught him a new thing. And, you know, I don't know if he's going to, you know, go to a teacher and be like, who the heck told you that? You know what I mean? Like, sorry,
I was just trying to help.
It's not right to do that. So, you know.
Yeah, no, you know? I definitely agree with you. I think like learning the best way to bridge that gap is definitely a process all in its own, beyond just the conversation. And I think especially in progressive spaces, a lot of us are kind of getting to a place where when we are talking to each other, we are speaking like a whole nother language, like the words that we use to describe things, and we kind of are approaching stuff from a very theory space. And it's like, if somebody, you know, if someone has never met a transgender person before in real life and has no experience with this, trying to understand, like trying to explain to somebody how gender is a construct and like how, you know, nothing is inherently feminine or masculine, and like, you know, trying to explain these things, people are like, okay, like you're losing me. And I think like finding a way, you know, not everything, like if you genuinely want to help somebody understand, you don't need to like show off. Like it's so much better to speak to someone in a way that they can understand. And like, I think it's really important that we always continue to cultivate this language, because I think it's so powerful when you have really specific language to explain what's happening. But like, it's not always the most appropriate venue. And I think like, there's a lot of, you know, and I think also people a lot of times are not, I mean, the internet is definitely a classic example of this, but it's like, you're not engaging to try to change somebody's mind. Like you may be engaging because you just want to show them like, I showed you, like, I shut you down. And it's like, it can be helpful if people are trying to find the words to articulate an argument, but like, that was not the proper venue. You know, Twitter will never be the proper venue to convince somebody of something. And I think it is like, a lot of it is like, you know, taking a second and being like, is this really the right venue for this? Or how do I make this the right venue for this? And I think that you do a really good job of, you know, being like, okay, I want to be appropriate for these kids, but also like, we need to have a conversation about this in some way. And I think like, you know, just continuing to ask those questions is a huge part of it. Just being like, okay, I'm assuming I don't know 100% how to do this. Like, how can I go about this a better way? And like, you know, there's usually somebody who can give you some sort of an answer that appeals to you and be like, okay, that makes sense. Like, let's see what we got. Because there's so many resources. I think it can be a little bit overwhelming for people trying to learn, but there's just so much out there to help you try to get a different perspective on things, and how to talk to kids about things, how to talk to your grandparents about stuff. And, you know, you just kind of have to be like, okay, here we go. I might read this and be like, wow, I never thought about this. And I don't know if I could do this, but like, you know, just start reading and see where it gets you.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
I know,
yes.
I'm
and
like,
one more thing I want to touch on before we end, because honestly, I could talk to you forever. But yeah, so I think that, you know, making sure that you're using the language, you know, for the correct audience and the correct avenue for how you're going to do that. And also too, like going back to that, like humbling and humanizing yourself. So I know that like everybody just needs to come to a general understanding of like, you know, we live in this society who has a lot of racist, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, you know, all that stuff, right? So naturally, us growing up in this society, you know, all of our experiences are unique, but if those things are taught to us, even if they're not taught to us at home, they're at
a
school,
friend's house,
their
parents are saying it.
One time with a friend, they're at, you know, the gas station, at a friend's house. Yes, exactly. Like people are gonna be exposed to it. So once I haven't studied how people have figured this out, but like I grew up with certain ideals being taught to me. I, you know, repeated those. It's terrible, right? And then I get to a point where I like grow up and I'm like, wait a second, that's very hurtful to somebody else. And why would I want to hurt them in the same way that I felt hurt from my experience, right? I somehow got to that point. But explaining to people who might still be struggling your process of getting out of that and stop
I'm an angel and I've always
you're the
been
progressive
saying the right thing, and I'll tell you how it is. It's like, no,
Yeah.
like we're probably still off a little bit.
Exactly. And just allowing people to just understand that it's a process for everybody. Like, I just didn't wake up. It was like, you know, at 4 and I was running around
right.
Yeah, I wasn't educating, you know, the little girls in my classroom, like, you know, how, you know, about feminism and toxic masculinity. I wasn't doing that. I was 4, you know, like, I wasn't always like this. But I think that could just be a really great way, I think, to help get rid of those barriers where people just start to be on the defense, because especially if it comes out in an attacking way. I mean, I don't really think anybody's going to get there with that, though I do understand why people do attack, you know, a lot of there's a lot of trauma and, you know, just hurt and pain from this. But the people that have privilege,
I know it's weird, but just lean into it. Yeah, engage. Exactly. It's a really funny interaction with my mom, where we were like hanging out, we had a little bit of wine, and something came up, and I was like, well, yeah, abolish police. And she was like, what did you just say? And I was like, you know, because, and I said something where I was like, yeah, you know, I think she was like, you have to be sarcastic. And I was like, no, I'm being serious. Like, you know, and I was like, you know, there's definitely some arguments to it. And she was like, no, like, I don't want to hear this. I don't want to hear this at all. And I like, you know, and she kind of started to be like, well, you know, what about all the things the police do for our community? And like, we need somebody to do X, Y, Z. And I was like, you know what, actually, let's not have this conversation right now. Like, it's 11 p.m. I have a glass of wine in my hand. Like, you know, it's been a long day, and I don't think that this is a good idea. Like, we should definitely have this conversation, but I don't think that this is the right move. And like, we will reconvene later when I have more energy. It was so funny. I was like, you know what? Actually, let's not have this conversation.
That is so.
And she was like, okay. But I was like, oh God, like, this isn't it. Your battles. It is just a part of being a human being. It would be great if I had never-ending energy to, you know, have every conversation. But, you know, we're all human, and we're all trying. And, you know, I think it's like, you know, for me, I had this really interesting experience at a protest where in Tallahassee, and it was led by a group of young Black activists, and I was standing with some of my friends who were like a little group of white people, and we had stopped. And at one point, somebody had the microphone, and the girl pointed to the group of us and said, "White people, look at each other and say, you know, look to the person to your left and say, hold yourself accountable." And it was a little bit uncomfortable to have everybody who was at the protest, like, kind of swivel over to where she was pointing. And, you know, I looked at my friend and we said, hold yourself accountable. And it felt a little bit weird, but I was like, you know what? Like, fine. This is not a personal attack on me. Like, I'm like, and I'm like, here I am. Like, I'm here to support this movement, and I'm in the march. And at the end of the day, like, we all do need to hold ourselves accountable. And like, this doesn't need to be a painful experience. You know, the most uncomfortable part is that everybody's looking, you know, like, that's kind of a weird feeling, but like, whatever, it's okay. Like, we're here, we're doing everything that we can. And if you can try to kind of like, if you start to feel defensive, like, take a second and is like, am I actually being attacked, or can I just take this in stride and let this be part of the lesson? It's hard. And and you know, that's easier said than done for a lot of people, and me too. It's work. It's hard. It's work. Like, just with everything, it's work. Relationships are work. It's all work, because we have a lot of like deconstructing to do from, you know, all the terrible brainwashing that has been done up until this point in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways, you know, people still use, you know, homophobia, transphobia, you know, certain parts of that to, you know, attack, or not attack people, but like convince people that like their transphobia is validated when it's not, and recognizing that, you know, people do that, and, you know, maybe why they do it, and then understanding like your position in those things, absolutely, and just being self-aware
and human as possible, really.
Thank you so much for having me. This was
my goodness,
so
Kathryn.
fantastic.
Well, definitely, like, you are welcome anytime you want to have a conversation about anything. You are so welcome.
Thank you so much, Kiersten, for having me on this.
You are so welcome.